Thanks again. Now I'm in full screen mode, so I won't be able to see your questions and comments in the chat box until the very end, but please do use the chat box to have conversations while I talk. That is totally fair game. So my name is Jim Lee. I'm the founder of a boutique investment advisory firm where we try to figure out what happens next. And over the years, I've found out that if you want to be in the right place at the right time, it's usually helpful to show up a few minutes early. And also, I found out that in order to understand the future, you also need to know the past. And this is sort of where I start with like the big macro history of us, okay? And over the course of our history, humanity has evolved three distinct types of technologies. Biological technologies started with agriculture, bread, and wine, and we've had these since before the beginning of classical civilization. Physical technologies involve engineering, metallurgy, machines, and motors. And digital technology is largely computational and has been around for less than a century now. And it's my belief that our technology preferences may influence human evolution, with the three main pathways to transhumanism being genetic modification, cybernetics, and something coming out called the mind-machine interface. So if anything, evolution hasn't stopped. It's probably accelerating at this point. And we'll see more change and variation in human form over the next 100 years than we've seen over the past 10,000. And down the road, if we go off planet, then things are going to start moving really fast. But it continues on. Most recently, in the last 40,000 years, we developed human language about 40,000 years ago. In sub-Saharan Africa, populations developed resistance to malaria. More recent changes in our biology have enabled us to have breakfast in the morning. So about 10,000 years ago, Northerners developed lactose tolerance for milk. The production of vitamin D from sunlight was evolved to offset the effects of vitamin deficiencies from grain-based diets. And I think probably the next thing to happen in human evolution is going to be genetically evolved sugar tolerance, okay? So just within the last 60 years, there are populations of urban pigeons that have evolved to thrive on high carbohydrate diets. So I'm a type 2 diabetic. I would really be happy to embrace this type of evolution so I can wake up and have donuts every morning, because that's not something that I can do right now. So this is kind of interesting. The fastest evolution seen in humanity happened in Tibet about 2,700 years ago. And it showed up in something called the EPAS1 gene, which helps regulate the body's response to a low oxygen environment. And this enables people to thrive with roughly 40% less oxygen. And we continue to see some really interesting mutations happening even today. So this is the story right here of a real life X-Man, and it showed up in the New England Journal of Medicine. So it's a legitimate scientific journal. And he had kind of a mutant power similar to David Dunn, the heroic security guard in the 2000 film Unbreakable. So in 1994, a Connecticut man was involved in a horrible car crash. And though a normal person would have received, multiple broken bones, this man came out uninjured, and the x-rays showed no fractures at all. And what happened was he was admitted into the Yale Bone Center. They ran some tests on him, and they found out that this man had a bone density that was 8 times higher than the average man his age. He had bones that were so dense, and he had a very square jaw, but his skeleton was otherwise normal. However, he had problems, and everyone else in his family had problems swimming because they were all so heavy. Another family member was admitted into the Yale Bone Center 6 years later for hip surgery, and they couldn't do it because the screws kept breaking on his bone. Okay. So this is all tied into a gene mutation called LRP5, the discovery of which could lead to treatments for osteoporosis. But it also sort of highlights trade-offs, right? You could be optimized for super strength and bone density, but you might not be able to do other things like get your hips replaced. Now here's another interesting story about the world's strongest kid who was born in Michigan. So when Liam Hoekstra was 5 months old, he was learning how to walk, and he did what other kids did, and he reached up to hold his mother's hands. And then what he did is he pulled himself up into an iron cross, right? And this is a very advanced gymnastic move that he's doing at 5 months of age. A year later, he threw a temper tantrum and kicked a hole in the wall. And at this point, his parents knew that something was up, all right? So they took him to the doctor. They found out that he had 40% more muscle mass than the average child his age. And also that his rapid metabolism to support this muscle required him to eat 6 meals a day. So again, from an evolutionary perspective, there are some trade-offs. On one hand, there is extraordinary strength. On the other hand, if this happened 10 or 20,000 years ago, there could be starvation risk if he couldn't take down a woolly mammoth. Now, what made Liam different is a genetic mutation that inhibited the growth of myostatin. So if you inhibit the inhibitor of muscle growth, what happens is you get a lot of muscle. So now what we're finding is that genetics is not just something that we're born with, and that we're slowly learning how to rewrite our own software code. So CRISPR works using RNA to find specific genetic sequences, then does kind of a cut and paste that's like word processing for your body. And what's kind of freaky about this technology is that it uses a viral vector. It uses viruses to update your body's software code. And as such, it's similar to change your genes now with a single injection. And if done early enough, those changes can be inheritable. So this woman in Texas runs her own biotechnology company. Her name is Elizabeth Parrish. At 45, she became her first patient, patient 0, and received 2 of her company's experimental gene therapies. And needless to say, neither of these treatments were approved by the FDA, okay? So one of them was to extend her telomeres by 20%. And it's kind of a big deal, but it's also really controversial because extending your telomeres may cause you to live longer. However, there is a type of cellular immortality that already exists, but you don't want it because it's called cancer. Okay, so they didn't know whether her experiments on herself would create personal harm yet. But she also didn't stop at that because while messing around with her DNA, she also decided to become superhuman, and she activated some genes to facilitate muscle growth as she gets older. Basically the same genes that made Liam Hoekstra a super baby. Okay. And you could argue that she's kind of crossing the line between medicine and human enhancement, and things become really blurry at this point. As far as longevity is concerned, there are about 200 genes responsible for aging that have been identified, and we're going to be hearing a lot more about these over the coming years. But there's some reasons why we might not be ready for this yet, okay? And this opens up the whole idea of biohacking. So 20 years ago, we woke up, we found the light switch. We were able to decode the human genome. We know where everything is, but we don't know what the switches do yet. Okay, so changing our genes is still very much a hit or miss proposition at this point. There's also the whole idea of the Mosaic Effect. And that is, if you attempt to change your body's genetic code, but not all of your cells get the memo, then they might not be able to have a conversation together, okay? So when you start doing this as an adult, you run the risk of not updating your entire system, just parts of it, and you may have some internal compatibility issues, okay? The third issue is what's called off-target mutations. And that is when you insert a word into the wrong paragraph, okay? And that is a risk. There are actually some people at University of Delaware that are working on a spell check now for the human genome to reduce the risk of off-target effects. So that's in the works at this point. And it's still very, very young. I mean, I think that we're going to be looking at genetic screening, pharmacogenetics, but in terms of actually messing around with our genes, we just don't quite know enough yet. Now, that being said, we don't just necessarily need genetics now to change our bodies. And there's some research that came out just last year showing that for the first time that our bone structure is starting to change to reflect the use of technology. So in Australia, doctors noticed that kids were growing horns out of their head. Okay, now not at the top, okay, they were actually growing them out at the base of the spine. And this all happened to support the muscle growth that happened while they were kind of doing this with their cell phones, leaning over, they had to support their head. So they noticed these small growths occurring again at the base. And what this says to me, you know, is that our technologies, our accessories, at some level, can change who we are, and sometimes even for the better. So at age 17, this is another real-life superhero, Hugh Herr. He was one of the best mountain climbers in the US, but in 1982, he was stuck in a blizzard for 3 nights, lost both of his legs due to frostbite. And for a few years, he wobbled around on artificial legs. And then he kind of realized that his prosthetics didn't need to appear human, and that he, in fact, could wear any device and extend his functionality. So he is now a doctor and has built for himself interchangeable legs for height, grip, speed, and grace. He can be 8 feet tall when he wants to be, just like Professor Gadget. He is still a mountain climber. He can climb things that he could never climb before. And he's a researcher, as I said, at MIT. So it's interesting to note that the word prosthesis, comes from a combination of words in Greek meaning to make stronger, because in some ways he is stronger than he was before. And this whole trend that could happen towards cybernetics kind of merging man with machine kind of reminds me of like what would happen if we start accessorizing body parts, okay? So the key here isn't that, you know, transhumanism is about how you're born, but who you are now and how you identify at the moment. So if you think about it, transgendered people are really at the forefront of the transhumanist movement, okay? So there's some really strong social signals right now that portions of Generation Z are becoming non-binary and experiencing more fluid gender and identity, right? And this is making non-traditional roles, making marketing based on gender a lot more complicated. So there's a new line of cosmetics, for example, right now, which is non-binary. It can be worn by men, it can be worn by women. People kind of decide when they wake up who they want to be. And I think that's going to accelerate even more quickly once we see that multiple personae and online identities will become more apparent with the onset of augmented reality. So kids waking up in virtual worlds, playing video games, already have multiple personalities. They will probably be much more comfortable with this than their parents. And it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. Okay. So my sense is that augmented reality is coming very soon with the advent of 5G data. And the idea here is putting a digital overlay on top of the real world. Lots of implications for businesses with the rise of digital storefronts. It deals with interface versus architecture. And I'm thinking that the lens might become the fifth screen after movies, TV, computers, and smartphones. So at some point, digital assistants could become our companions, possibly the gatekeepers for decision making. Because in the old days, people had secretaries, then they had administrative assistants, and now they're going to have digital assistants, whereas the algorithm becomes the proxy for the end customer. And then it becomes a matter of what the lens allows you to see. So in the investment industry, if you don't pass the filters on Morningstar, you don't necessarily exist. So businesses are no longer marketing just to consumers, but they're also beginning to market to the search algorithms as well. Okay. So a lot of folks, including Ray-Ban, are working on these portable lenses. Smart contracts are coming out soon. Mojo Vision already has a digitally enhanced contact lens. So we're slowly bringing technology into our lives and into our bodies. Now, leave it to the military to take this a few steps further, right? So this is a report that they did, and by 2050, they expect to have super soldiers with ocular enhancements so that they can see in the dark, auditory enhancement for communication and protection, direct neural enhancement for thought and communications transfer. And then here's the last one, programmed muscular control through an optogenetic bodysuit sensor web. Okay, think about that, programmed muscular control, right? That's not scary at all. What could possibly go wrong, right? This is the military. What does that mean? So I worry about this a little bit, right? And this sort of ties into this whole idea of the brain-computer interface. And as I started digging into this, I found out that there are a lot of labs working on this, including those owned by Elon Musk of Tesla, right? And how many options they're developing now to connect your brain to the internet, okay? So far you can sprinkle your brain with microchips called neural dust. You can unfold a neural mesh to create a communications layer, or you can rewire your head altogether with neural stents, right? And this is all happening right now. Pretty much everyone is doing it, including Facebook. Okay, so Facebook last year bought a neural interface startup called Control Labs, which is best known for its mind reading wristband. Okay, and you sort of wonder, you know, where is Facebook going with all this? And I think that what they're interested in is what comes after we create this connection between mind and machine, is you can start migrating your consciousness onto the machine, okay? And this takes us out to, you know, probably the furthest edge of what's called substrate independent minds, okay? So if we could upload our consciousness onto the internet, we could live forever on a virtual world, which could be a paradise for at least as long as someone's around to pay the electric bill, okay? We could also have multiple copies of ourselves continuing to learn and evolve in simulation. Or we could also download those minds back into physical bodies when we wanted to. We could conceivably explore life as a toaster if we wanted to, or go into a body, biological substrate, or go into an android. But this really will widen up to a pretty broad range of human experience if we get that far. And I'm not convinced that we will. I think this is pretty far out stuff. So I was actually really intrigued when the Pew Research Center did a study of which enhancement made people the most enthusiastic and also the most worried, okay? So gene editing actually made people the most enthusiastic as a way of potentially reducing disease, specifically inheritable disease. Brain chip implants came out last, right? People were most worried about that and probably the least enthused about that. And they have a cybernetic alternative here, synthetic blood for much improved physical abilities. A lot of people have been working on synthetic red blood cells so that you could swim underwater for half an hour. That sounds kind of cool to me, Who needs scuba gear at that point? But we're not ready for this yet, right? But we will be at some point. So if you think back to the 1980s, right? People were super timid about LASIK eye surgery when it first became a thing. And now about 2 million people a year get laser eye surgery. Same thing with pacemakers, right? Implants to keep your heart going. And, possibly with brain implants, it could happen. I look back at in vitro fertilization, which was hugely controversial in the 1970s. People thought that we were playing God, and now not so much. It's a pretty regular procedure for people who have fertility issues. So I think our culture can change, but it takes a while to catch up with technology and the possibility behind technology. But there's another alternative, which I'd kind of like to wrap up with, and that is this idea that, we're not human beings having a spiritual experience, but maybe we're spiritual beings having a human experience. And this comes from a favorite futurist of mine who was a theologian, anthropologist, and philosopher. His name was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who also said that human evolution hasn't stopped, but it's simply moved inside. And way back in the 1920s, Desjardins introduced this concept of the noosphere, which he described as the sphere of thought encircling the Earth that has emerged through evolution as a consequence of growth in complexity. And you can sort of think about this as the internet of consciousness that connects all of us in thought, and that the noosphere is a type of information space where ideas become things. We all simulate reality in our minds when we dream. And they may have some persistence there that exists even beyond our own lives. And if you look at a number of traditions, this has been around for thousands of years. The Hindus refer to it as the Akasha. Irvin Laszlo refers to it as the field. David Bohm, who was a colleague and friend of Einstein, calls it the implicate order. And then British scientist Rupert Sheldrake refers to it as the morphogenic field. So I kind of wonder, what would happen if we all sort of plugged into this network of consciousness, right? And what if the alternative to hard technology was the soft technology of culture, right? It could be a fourth evolutionary path. We could focus on becoming smarter, or we could choose to become wiser. And at that point, all sorts of interesting things could happen, right? We could go from always wanting more to focusing on having enough and focusing on quality. We could go from living longer to living better. You go from competition to cooperation. Instead of focused on getting the right answers, maybe it's about asking the right questions. And then with this, I think our mindset could change from the question of what could possibly go wrong to what could possibly go right. So I just want to put that out there for you to sort of think about, because really, if you think about it, the future is a choose your own adventure, right? You get to pick your own outcome. You get to decide where to go with all of this. And what I'm hoping we get to do when we go into the breakout groups in a few minutes is talk about what appeals to us, what we want to see happen, what are some of the unexpected implications of these technologies. But I think we might actually have just a few minutes for some questions here. And with that, I'd like to look at what's going on in the chat screen. And
well, if you'd like, Jim, I actually, Hendrik Jan put them into a nice little format for me. If you'd like, I can just go ahead and read them off to you. Some of the, we won't get to all of them. How much do you want, how much time do we have for questions?
we have 5 minutes. I promised we would get started with networking at 4:40.
Perfect. Well, I'll tell you what, so let's hop right in. I love it. I thought somebody was going to go here talking about AI, you know, artificial intelligence. So right now, the question that came in is when will AI surpass human intelligence? And then what's your take on singularity? So I believe right now, my knowledge on this is a little bit cursory, but I believe right now we're in a period known as kind of narrow artificial intelligence, where it's very task specific. Next one up the chain is general artificial intelligence, or AGI. And then we talk super, you know, what was it? It's, what's the next one after that? Like Skynet, that's super intelligence.
Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what's your take on that right now? How does that figure, and what should we be concerned with or excited about?
Yeah, it's happening. Mostly in the context of what's known as machine learning, the ability to do discrete tasks. But we're also beginning to see some advances in terms of machine creativity as well, through generative adversarial networks. They're beginning to do things like painting and create images of people that don't exist, and all kinds of interesting things. I think what happens here is that computers at this point don't have consciousness, and they don't have the ability to choose what they want to work on. We're still kind of telling them what to work on at this point. So I'm not too worried about AI as long as we use it as a tool, and as long as we keep it contained, okay? There's a lot that it doesn't do well at this point. It doesn't communicate, and it doesn't play well with others. So I see a potential for people to work as sort of tutors for artificial intelligence, to teach them basic social skills, to teach them right and wrong, to teach them human values. I think that's going to be really important down the road.